morning and welcome to Common Hour. Excuse me. My name is Rick Moog. I am chair of the Common Hour Committee this year and professor of chemistry. Before we begin today's event, I want to let you know that next week's Common Hour will be held right here and will feature Jerry Taylor. The topic of his talk is The Conservative Case for Climate Action: Why I Stopped Being a Skeptic and Embraced the Cause. Also, let's thank this week's pizza servers, F&M Squash Aces. F&M Squash Aces are student volunteers who provide one-to-one mentoring, tutoring, and coaching of middle and high school students. Started in 2009, ACES provides students from Reynolds Middle School and McCaskey High School with squash instruction and academic support. Thanks to over 35 F&M student volunteers, including members of the Diplomat Squash team, ACES bridge to the local community. So as is our practice, there will be a question and answer period for the last part of this presentation. Please plan to stay until the end of the question and answer period, and as always, Common Hour will end promptly by 12:30. The question and answer period is open to members of the F&M community. We give first priority to students. If you have a question, please come to one of these two microphones, and please form a line at these two microphones so that our speaker has a sense of how many questions there are to address. When you come forward, please state your name, your class year, and/or your college affiliation. There will also be a reception with our speaker immediately following Common Hour at Bonchek College House. And to help people find their way to Bonchek College House, when the Common Hour is over, back by the door back here on the left, there'll be students from Bonchek wearing these brightly colored burgundy t-shirts that look like this, so you can find them, and they will help you find your way to Bonchek College House. Great room where the reception will continue. And now I'd like to introduce Kyla Nitahara, class of 2020.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for coming. So Megan Redshirt Shaw is our Common Hour speaker today. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania in English, her master's from Harvard Graduate School of Education in Higher Education, and has started her doctoral work at the University of Minnesota in higher education this fall. An enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, she's the founder of Natives in America, an online literary publication for Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian youth. Passionate about Indigenous rights issues, college admissions, and greater Native presence in media, she believes in empowering young people to use their voices for the issues they care about in their communities. I met her in 2015 at College Horizons, which is a college prep program for Native students. Her guidance through the program and continued support for me through the years is a testimony to the benefits and strength of Native people and all people empowering and lifting each other up. I'm so happy that we stayed in touch over the years, and I'm very excited for you to hear what she has to say. Sponsored by the Miller's Humanities Fund, the Anthropology Department, and the Earth and Environment Department, and Bonchek College House, here's Megan Redshirt Shaw.
Good morning. Hamitaki api, chante washtea nape cheuzapi, chanku washtewi machi apie, wajiahanaha himataha, bide ota ontue akta watie, Walnut Creek otue el matumpi, California ga Connecticut ga Michigan ga Arizona ed imachiahie, Minnesota wonspe wankantia el walblada. Lokol michaji ki chanko ashtenwi pilamaya piavie. My English name is Megan Redshirt Shaw. My Lakota name is Ciksuye, or Woman of Good Roads. I was given that name as a young woman and have been expected to live my life accordingly as a responsibility. I am enrolled Oglala Lakota with the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. I currently live in Minneapolis as a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. I was born in Walnut Creek, California, and grew up in California, Arizona, Connecticut, and Michigan. The language that you heard this morning was Lakota, and that is the first language that my mother spoke as a child. This morning I woke up to see the sun rising near a city I lived in for 6 years, Philadelphia. My undergraduate experience at the University of Pennsylvania was tremendously complex, full of a lot of incredible friendships and very difficult memories, mentorships that shaped who I would eventually become, and moments that defined my work. Painful and deeply rich with growth, I was thankful in landing at the airport last night without having to experience the same feelings I felt every semester that I came back to Penn from visiting home. An ache I don't feel anymore, that wishing that I could get back on the plane and return west. The feeling some of you may experience in being time zones and miles away from the people you love. I'm closer to home now, and I'm in the phase of my life where I'm building a new home with my fiance. So I'm here to tell you that after graduation, you can go and be whoever you want to be, near mountains, lakes, trees, in urban spaces, somewhere very far away from here, or right down the road. I wish that for every one of you who feels very far away, that you get to go and figure out what home means to you. If you found it here at Franklin and Marshall, that's incredible. Cherish that feeling. I feel immensely lucky to be here and to share this space for the next hour. I'd like to thank a few people who made this visit possible: Kyla Nitahara, Marianne Levine, the entire tech team who spent this morning putting up the screens today, and Franklin and Marshall for their hospitality in bringing me here and for hosting me during my visit. Also, thanks to everybody that's hosting food and to all the students who are here to participate. I first connected with Kyla at College Horizons at Stanford University, a program that promotes Native students with the opportunity to connect with other university-bound Native students over a week-long program of events and opportunities. I'm really inspired and thankful to Kyla for bringing me to the place where she chose for her undergraduate experience. What an incredible young woman. Pila mai Kyla for inspiring me. I also want to take a moment to thank Eric Hirsch, who invited me to speak to his environmental justice course this morning. And I want to thank him for a reason he doesn't know yet. I've just started my doctorate at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and one of the questions that you're often asked as a doctoral student is about your elevator pitch, or an opportunity to tell someone what you've decided to become the world expert on. My elevator pitch to people has been, I want to understand Native student success. I want to look at the gap in between high school and college. I want to understand how we get more of our kids to college in the first place. But honestly, I needed something more academic sounding. Earlier this week, Dr. Hirsch emailed me and said this exact quote: "We'd love to hear about your work with young people and your vision for undoing colonial education in the context of Indigenous rights issues." Yes. Yes. Thank you for putting words to my research. And this part has become my new elevator pitch. So thank you to Dr. Hirsch for telling me exactly what I've been trying to say. I promise to give you a shout out in my someday dissertation. I would like to kick things off today by presenting you with a few questions to consider. Whose traditional homelands does Franklin and Marshall occupy? Name 5 sovereign Native nations in the United States. And what exactly does the US Constitution say about Indigenous people? So I'm going to have you guys take a minute, turn and talk to your neighbor, and see if you can come up with these few answers. just a few more seconds. Okay. So that I prevent you from talking about the weather or the boy in class that you find cute, genuinely try to answer these questions in your mind as we work through today. How many of you felt confident with answers to all three of these topics presented? Can anybody give a show of hands? It's important, and these are the things that we're going to discuss a little bit today. While education in America has enacted a history of liberal and just opportunities, not everyone was afforded them for a very long time. The land, and who spiritually understands it, will always be deeply complicated. Who America believes the land belongs to will always be complex. At every institution I have worked for or attended, I have encouraged the administration to recite a land acknowledgement of whose Indigenous territory it is that the university rests on during large public events, so that you and we place ourselves on the land. A land acknowledgement can not only make a huge impact on a Native student sitting in the audience, as I remember that it always did for me, but it also grounds all of us in reality. America occupies our Indigenous nations, our traditional homelands. How many of you knew whose traditional homeland Franklin and Marshall is seated on? By a raise of hands. Traditionally, we are currently seated on the land of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a community that is currently a living, sovereign nation full of real people with real problems and complex issues, real people with real impact. This is also my moment to call on Franklin and Marshall to consider writing a land acknowledgement into your charter and into every school event, if you have not already done so. As students during my undergraduate time at Penn, we worked with the administration to write an acknowledgement at the beginning of very large events, and it's still used today. Let us hold a moment of silence to honor their lived experiences and the pieces of their history that they continue to try to preserve for the continued benefit of the generations to come. I also asked all of you to recite to each other 5 sovereign nations that currently occupy the United States. How many of you felt like you could answer that question easily? Okay. I ask you this because I know that this is a failure of our education system. I know this will be a part of my work to try to unpack. Because as a Native student skimming over a history book that mentions your community once, that has impact. And there are scholars trying to ask questions of why there hasn't been an opportunity to tell our true histories. That we are 573 sovereign nations strong with hundreds of other communities who have not held the privileges of being formally recognized by the United States. This is why I can't give you a slide with easy answers. I can't put up 572 tribes and all of the hundreds of tribes that aren't recognized federally. You have to find these answers on your own. You have to do the work yourselves. From this moment forward, it's no longer on the teachers and the history books who failed you. I am calling on you to know the tribal nations your homes, schools, and events currently occupy. My sovereign tribal nation is the Oglala Lakota Nation. Clearly, I am a little bit biased and proud. We are located 100 miles south of Rapid City, South Dakota, near the Nebraska-South Dakota border. We have 30,000 tribal members who live on reservation and 10,000 of us who live off. We are a plains community. We speak the Lakota language. I did not grow up there, but I return every year to visit family or attend ceremony. I know how real our community is. And yet, America's national rhetoric describes our country as a nation of immigrants, erasing the experiences of the Indigenous people who have occupied these grounds for thousands of years. It actively erases me. It erases my community and the summers I spent looking out at the Badlands, my grandmother's face who I can no longer see. It erases who we are. This attempted erasure may not be that surprising to you if you know how the U.S. Constitution references us. How many people felt like they knew the answer to that question? Merciless Indian savages is what the US Constitution says about us. And that certain states actually didn't grant us citizenship on our own homelands until 1957. That we are still experiencing voter suppression in places like the Dakotas. They didn't create this country with us in mind. In fact, a lot of the scholarship indicates that the foundation of America is based on us hanging in the balance of extinction. That in words and in dispossession, they have tried to bury us. This doesn't make me sad or upset, because what they didn't know was that we are seeds. And this is true for many of our lived experiences. For students from underrepresented backgrounds, we are always enrolling in educational spaces that don't often like to acknowledge stories of trauma or dispossession, of who built the oldest buildings on campus, of who lost for the creation of the university. Institutions of higher education were not created for women, for underrepresented students, or anyone with challenge of ability. Create combinations of any of those identities, and the layers of trauma become even more complex. Despite the fact that America tends to believe it stands in time immemorial, this was only a few generations ago, and many of us continue to feel a lack of understanding on university campuses. 2 weeks ago, in fact, my fiance John, who is Standing Rock, Dakota, and I were driving across the state of Iowa when we were pulled over by police. He took my fiance back to the police squad car and began asking him what seemed to be a normal set of questions, until he asked, "What is she?" referring to me. What was I, othering me as he was othering him by making him sit in the squad car? When John shared my name, Megan Redshirt Shaw, the police officer said, "Oh, I knew she was Native," and then conveniently chose to start asking about drugs and weapons in the car. The experience felt a little bit like a bad joke, starting with 2 Native PhD students driving in the American Midwest, but that police officer didn't care about my degrees or my privileges. He stuck his head in on my side of the window and he othered me in our safe space, one of the few places where we can laugh and joke about what it means to be Indigenous in America. My master's from Harvard meant nothing to him. All that mattered was that I watched his every mood when he had my fiance in the car, making him feel like we didn't belong. Suddenly, I was back out in the world trying to justify the way that I look, as I know some of you experience when you leave this campus. And I'm not here to make you feel guilty. This happens across every profession and in every space. I'm also not here to make you feel responsible for the past. I just want you to understand what reality looks like for me as one person, for what it may look like for some of your classmates. There are days where the way my face is cut dominates the narrative of who I am, instead of the education I've earned. I couldn't give that cop my resume. I can't hand it to the men I come across who make weird comments because I'm a young woman of color. By putting these narratives today connected to our complex past, we as human beings are not taking direct ownership over decisions made by our ancestors that were problematic. We are creating spaces for dialogue in a country that is not often owned up to its injustices. A very complex country with a lot of work to do. And I say that across political lines, across party lines. Everyone has work to do. I can't be one of those speakers who blindly tells you to vote. I'm going to be one of those speakers who asks you if the people you are voting for represent your issues. I haven't had the chance to meet many politicians who do for me or for my community. And oftentimes, if I wasn't tweeting at America in my mentions all the time about taking a look inward, maybe I would run myself. But that's where I want all of you to start asking yourself the question, what do we need and how do we get there? I have been in many conversations where we were given the opportunity to talk about the timelines of our own communities for rights in this country. After tracing these stories, sometimes we are able to have a better understanding of why walking onto a campus can sometimes make us feel marginalized or alone. Because of these observations, I want to speak to all of the students in the room who have spent their educational experiences in learning spaces feeling very small or unseen. And I want all of you who feel fully seen to also listen. As I have come to understand about my own education, none of the institutions I attended or worked for were created for me. I am a Lakota woman. The United States government believed that the education of Native people was only valuable if they agreed to be assimilated, but feared that our education could also ignite our power. That if we were educated in the colonizers' histories and rhetoric, perhaps we could undo their conquerings. We had to be docile in order to engage in the academy. Some agreed to this and some didn't. We as Indigenous people are still struggling within this colonized framework today. Kill the Indian and save the man. Savages and savagery are the only way they know how to live. Their Indigenous knowledge systems are futile in comparison. Now we know that we're not, and now we know who we are, but they never thought that we would. What I've realized over time, and after being able to reflect and look back on my undergraduate years in the rearview mirror, is that attending these spaces as someone like us, those of us who still have to explain our identities to society, is an act of resilience and resistance. Even if you have not fully recognized your power, you are brilliant. You are the future. You are what carries me through, and you are Franklin and Marshall. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams. I am tremendously proud of your continued accomplishments, as all of the people who came in line before you are, and I look forward to how the future will shape you. And even though I'm taking the stage today, my perspective is not really the one that matters. The students on campus who exist here day to day, that's the perspective that matters. Who exist on campuses across the country and still have to explain their lived identities to their professors, colleagues, and peers, engaging in stretched emotional labor and no compensation many times, other than that feeling of, if I don't say it, who will? So even though I may share some thoughts today, remember that I am outside looking in at F&M. Remember that I am drawing from my own truths that may not align with yours. To the Native students in the room who will always have Franklin and Marshall as a piece of their history, you are who should be up here, not me. I will try to honor you in the things I share today. You are paving the path, so dream big. Kicking off Native American Heritage Month with issues focused on Indigenous identity, I'm going to challenge every single one of you to be and to stay uncomfortable, taking time to acknowledge your own privileges and non-privileges in race, socioeconomic status, legal status, gender, and ability, reflecting on your identities as students, faculty, staff members, and community members. I again acknowledge my own privilege in being able to come into your space and share my thoughts without knowing the lived experiences of all of you being a member of this community. So I'm going to have you guys take a few moments to stretch and to discuss the following questions with those seated around you. What is the definition of privilege, and what are the privileges you carry? Just a few moments. Just another few seconds. And I'm going to bring us back together. That was so easy. I used to work at a high school and we used to have to do the clapping exercise. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Okay. I missed that. While these conversations may have been difficult for some of you, this is the only way we can move forward in conversation. As if you as individuals are willing to acknowledge the space you occupy and your positionalities to the work that you do. Some of my own privileges. I'm half white, I'm able-bodied, cis, hetero, upper middle class, native English speaker, a natural-born US citizen. I'm also highly educated. And what you may not have even realized, and in the work that I do, is that one is being a member of a higher education community that is tremendously privileged, even when the outside world can't see it. You are armed with colonial knowledge. When I someday get to my PhD, I will be one of less than 100 Native students in the entire country who graduate with a doctorate annually. My mother was one of those students. My fiance will reach those ranks next year. Therefore, in my family alone, we will carry 3 Native doctoral degrees of the 100 annually. Immense and incredible privilege. I have to tell you this so that you understand that my perspective is not on behalf of all Indigenous people or nations, and that I'm not here to tell you about Native American people. I'm not here to teach you about who we are, as I will never fairly represent the 567 federally recognized nations, the Alaskan corporations, Hawaiian communities, and all of the Indigenous stories across this country. I will never be able to represent the misguided history books your childhood classroom subjected you to, the often told narratives of who Indigenous people are and what we've experienced in our struggle, how every Indigenous person feels about sovereignty, land, treaty rights, misrepresentations, and colonization. I'm here to ask you to start surrounding yourself in the things you read, in the places you visit, and then the histories you learn with the understanding that this country, however you may feel about it, is a settler colonial state, and that there are thousands of stories to tell about how that state has come to impact our people. I'm here today to share some of my own reflections as a 30-year-old Lakota Wian, a Lakota woman who's still trying to figure things out. The men for whom this institution is named, Justice John Marshall and Benjamin Franklin, both carry unique identities in the struggle for Indigenous people. While Marshall believed in our assimilation, he also contributed to our sovereignty through the Marshall Trilogy, which caused some people to argue that he was for Native people in limited ways. The jury is still out on that one for me. B. Frank, as we endearingly called him in undergrad, who also founded my own undergraduate institution, the University of Pennsylvania, wrote about the barbarity of Native people in his own autobiography, stating that if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. He did not think particularly highly of us. I loved to give him a big nod and a wave every time I walked down the path at Penn and saw the 500 statues of him I had to look at every day. He didn't want uncivilized savages attending his schools or speaking at his hallowed halls of learning, but here I am. Here will forever be. If I ever have the power to possess a time machine, I hope I can go back in time and take a look at all of those founding fathers and tell them what's up. There are many dreams I hope to make happen, and this one, despite the need for a time machine, remains very high on my list. And maybe none of you ever think about these guys. In my work of dismantling colonial education, I have to, because they are the foundation of our education system. I'm not going to look like either of these guys when I'm an elder, at least I hope not, but they were the founders of places like here and the schools I attended, so I have to in some way acknowledge the past. For me as a Native person, I have to emotionally undo how they felt about me to say, this too is my school, and I belong here. I had to do this throughout undergrad. When I started as an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, I moved across the country from Arizona, where I was surrounded by diverse friends, many Native, to an institution where, out of 20,000 undergraduate and graduate students, I was one of only 5 self-identifying Native students that I knew of. I could count the number of Native students I knew on one hand, 5 fingers. I imagine the Native students here at Franklin and Marshall feel the same. On our sacred homelands and the country built on our backs, we feel othered. We're made to believe as that we're lucky to be here in these hallowed halls, when the reality is, and what I tell every student who falls into the margins is, they're lucky to have us. These institutions are privileged to witness our traditional knowledges, to hear our long, complex names echoed through their classrooms, braids down our backs, calm on our faces through stereotype threat in classes. At Penn, there was no Native Center, and just barely a Native student group. As a sophomore, I was to take over the Native student organization as the co-chair on a drive to Ithaca, New York, asked by a girl who I had only met once, sitting next to a guy I had never even spoken to. We knew that if it wasn't us who took over, we didn't know if our narrative would ever be told. We decided we would take the institution on. And apart from my new leadership opportunity and an incredible network of friends who held me up over those 4 years, my greatest heroes were the staff and administrators who always said yes to my ideas, even when they were uncomfortable or had no idea what I was talking about. Let's write a land acknowledgement into the school's constitution. Let's host a powwow. Let's bring speakers. Let's recruit more Native students. At 20 years old, let me dream. Let me push up against this colonial system. Let me keep on in the name of resistance. They believed in me, and even if they didn't, they never showed it. They only said yes. The director of the Intercultural Center, who ordered us a full buffet of food every meeting we had, even when she knew only 3 of us were going to show up. She knew there would always be leftovers, and she knew that we would take them home and enjoy them over the weekend. The professor who pushed me outside of my comfort zone and made me accountable for my mistakes, once locking me out of our classroom when I was late. Even when he handed me back papers covered in bread, he reminded me often that he knew I was capable of great things. The ladies who worked in the Starbucks coffee shop who started giving me free drinks every time I came in. I would select a table and sit for hours trying to study, them coming over to give me a hug and make me feel loved when sometimes I felt very alone. On a campus that was not created for me, thousands of miles from my family, I found home because the staff and administrators and students, none of whom looked like me or had any idea what it was like to be Lakota, always said yes. Because my friends said yes. I believe in you. This responsibility is not only on the faculty and staff in the room, but also on all of you as fellow students. I have met hundreds of people in my life who don't know what it's like to be Lakota, but the reason I'm in a doctoral program and given the chance to come and visit places like Franklin and Marshall is because I had many incredible adults in my life and many friends who believed that I could. This is not to say that the journey hasn't been tremendously hard, and I don't want to tell you that working in education is easy. There are a lot of systems that make access in this country tremendously complex, especially for Native students. I deeply and personally remember many of those systems that tried to hold me down as a young person. The way teachers would sometimes look at the little brown girl in their classes, the war whoop noises boys on the playground would make towards me. Even when I became an undergraduate, I can still feel crying in the courtyard during our class break after my professor had destroyed my all-night work, taking a deep breath, wiping the tears away with my fists, and going back in for the second half of workshop. I can see myself feverishly doing my work on 3 hours of sleep, with a few dollars in my bank account from my restaurant shift, desperately needing coffee. I remember daydreaming that more Native students would fall from the sky at our weekly meetings, wishing our community was bigger, but still pressing on to plan big events. I remember that pull of defeat and the push of carrying on. In the work that I'm embarking on now, I am trying to be my professor who saw me come back into class. I am trying to be the women at Starbucks, knowing I needed a large coffee and affirmation, and I am trying to be the director of the Intercultural Center, feeding us so we could get to work and get the work done. I am now the adult trying to read those situations with younger generations to say, today is the day I will build them up. Today is the day that they are strong. Today is the day that I will be fully present, that I will say yes, that I will engage them in difficult dialogue because they are ready. Today is our day together. In education systems that don't always want us to win, in classrooms that are sometimes unwilling to admit that they are afraid of our power. In my life as an undergraduate, again, not a single adult understood my experiences, and I did not have a single Native faculty or staff member, but they knew I knew who I was, and they knew I needed someone to have faith in what I was dreaming. Today I am who I am because they did. I went on from Penn to admit thousands of students to college. I pursued my master's degree at Harvard because I was used to dreaming. I plan on graduating with my doctorate and traveling back to the Black Hills to raise my someday children in their homelands and to build a school with my family that will always say yes. From that first day of college on, it's anyone's game for every single one of you, but you have the power to make the difference in someone else's life. And if we say yes, we will build generations upon generations of people who will say yes to each other. Over my career in education spaces, I will work with students who will break my heart. I will work with students who will soar to the occasion, students who will surprise me, and students who become attached to me who I never thought would. I will work with students who will not like my style, my methods of mentorship will not work for, who we may lose in the work. In the work that you someday fall in love with, across the humanities and sciences, you have to be willing to take that leap, that you are going to feel defeated, and that you will feel pressure not to show others your vulnerability. Some of the times the people in my life ignited me the most were when they allowed me to see that they too were human beings. When my professor was diagnosed with lymphoma and would openly share about his tough days as a man who embodied everything that Penn was created for. When the director of the Intercultural Center cried because she was frustrated by the bureaucracy of the university system as a woman of color trying her best to serve all of us students who were going to fall through the cracks without her support. When the women at Starbucks told me that it had been a long morning of trying to take the bus during a snowfall and they were deeply tired. I remembered all of them in my own work, and that the most powerful thing we can show each other is that we struggle too. Across all of your privileges and workings in your own identity, on this campus, every single one of us has had a day where we've had enough. Today, I also want to remind you that it's okay and that our greatest strengths lie holding up each other, even when we ourselves feel most defeated. That is selflessness, and that is love, and that is the greatest gift you can give to each other. That brings me to my positionality, to my work. Because every single one of us has positionality to the thing that we love. Even if you're working in a science lab and you're plating bugs or watching liquid fizzle, I hope that somewhere in all that you do, there is love. My positionality started with the love of my parents, who married despite two families that were not thrilled by the thought that a white man and a Lakota woman were getting married. In fact, so unthrilled that none of my grandparents attended my parents' wedding. One generation away from me, and 42 years of marriage later. My mother, Delphine, and my father, Richard, were the two adults in my life who taught me what yes was. Yes to working hard in school, yes to college, yes to my master's, yes to my PhD, yes to rest. Yes to moving to Pennsylvania and California and Massachusetts and New Mexico and Minnesota. Yes to crying. A lot of crying. Yes to knowing my culture. Yes to hearing my mother speak the Lakota language. Yes to ceremony. Yes to trying to figure out what healing means. And so because of the gifts my parents gave me through a 3-letter word called yes and a 4-letter concept called love, I fell in love with John, who always builds me up by saying yes too. Yes, we've got this. Yes, we can make this work. And together we are trying to dismantle all the no's our people, our Indigenous people, have been given. And we will try to show our future Native kids what it means to say yes in a country where they have tried to hold us down by the mainstream media, by the colonizers, by the institutions, by the state, by violence and oppression, but never by love, and never by saying yes to each other. In 2014, I created an online publication called Natives in America. To date, we have published more than 70 pieces by 45 Native youth writers, including research, prose, and poetry, in an effort to reclaim contemporary Native narratives through the written word. I don't want my story to be the only one out there. I want to be empowered in the collective, to build a space where Native students, without the limitations of distance, would be able to express and relate to one another's experiences, stories, and challenges. Across Native nations, it has been beautiful to see the network unfold and to see their stories be shared by Native and non-Native readers. It's not perfect. Sometimes we'll go months without a story, but I want us to tell the narratives when we're ready to. These lives full of resilience deserve to be on every college campus across the country. I hope to continue to encourage and advocate for Native student recruitment through college success stories like the ones we publish on Natives in America. I am Lakota, and that's why I'm here. I was rooted in culture and tradition and light, and thanks to the things my mother and father taught me, and my siblings raised in hope and resilience, I am trying today to tell you yes, go for it. You will push forward for the next generation of leaders who need us, because that's what makes us who we are. Whether it's you who's going to lead or the generations coming, we will soar because kids in classrooms growing up in this America or on the Oceti Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, my homelands, need us to. We will learn from each other. In Lakota, Weksuye, Ciksuye, Miksuye means I remember you, remember me. It's one of the greatest phrases my mother ever taught me. I remember daily to honor myself in my work. I remember the educators who made the difference in my own life as a student, and I hope that in the years to come, the students I so deeply believe in will remember me. So choose to remember, and to remember each other. I want to bring us back to the territory I told you we occupy today of the Haudenosaunee people, to the hundreds of tribal nations that feel a deep interconnectedness to the land we love, to a constitution that took our land from us and tried to bury us. We will never be buried. We will never stay quiet, because that's not who we are. The land is here and it remembers us, but we have to be empowered to remember ourselves. Remember Indigenous people. Just as I asked you earlier to remember, remember me. Our narratives are the foundation of the country you reside in, and we're not going anywhere. I always remember a Native high school student who I met through the same program Kyla attended, once telling me and a group of Native educators, "Be as strong as the land that made you." Throughout the hardest days, and even when it feels like the world isn't saying yes, I remind myself that we are of the land, so we will always be strong. Remember this. Finally, check out Natives in America for more contemporary stories about Indigenous identity. I don't want to be the only person that's talking about these stories. It's deeply important that you educate yourselves across tribal nations, across tribal perspectives, and across ages as well. I'm also here for the students to help, to connect, to answer your questions, to talk about graduate school. It is possible. Anything that you dream, anything that you believe in for your future is entirely possible. I'm here to discuss decolonial thought, dismantling the patriarchy, the West, your experiences, anything. Please reach out to me on social media, email me. I am here to say yes to all of you. Pilo Maiaye, thank you to Franklin and Marshall. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to ask any students who have questions to please come forward.
Hello. Hi. I'm Jasmine. We met in class earlier. I'm a senior anthropology major. This is kind of a really personal question for me. In class today, you spoke about the decision your children will have to make on which tribe they want to represent. I'm wondering and personally searching for what your message would be about identity for your grandchildren and great-grandchildren and those that come after who, depending on who their parents fall in love with, may not have the cultural privilege to enroll at all, or those who have been disenfranchised through violence from their tribes and ancestry because of colonialist structure of genetic quantum.
Thank you for asking that question. So one of the things that I had shared in a morning session with Eric's class is we talked a little bit about enrollment. And for those of you that are not familiar with tribal enrollment, and I actually misquoted how many federally recognized tribes there are. There are now 572 federally recognized tribes. I said 567, so I apologize to the 6 who have worked really hard to be federally recognized. So of the 572 tribal nations, the ones under the federal government, they have sovereignty. They have jurisdictional sovereignty over their communities. And one of the things that we talked about in class this morning was how community is decided and who is selected to be a tribal member, to be enrolled. And one of the things that I shared about my own struggle with enrollment is that my fiance is half Dakota from Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and I'm half Lakota from the Oglala Lakota nation. And those are two different nations with two different sovereign jurisdictions. What that also means for Native people is that when we have kids, our children will have to choose one or the other. So they will either have to be enrolled at Standing Rock or they will have to be enrolled at Oglala Lakota, which becomes really complicated in how they identify themselves, right? And I was talking about this, and I share it openly because I'm still trying to work through it as well. This idea that the government has tried to colonize us through tribal enrollment, through tracking us, through making us carry tribal enrollment cards, which I actually always travel with. So it's a really good question. And I think that one of the things that's really important for people who identify as Indigenous to remember is that a lot of the things that I talk about is that they didn't want us to win, right? And the way that they push us in how we identify ourselves is by making us think about it with regards to blood quantum. It's not about blood quantum. It's about knowing who you are. It's about knowing your culture. It's about speaking your languages. It's about giving back to your community. And it's about knowing who you are. And so, I don't know what the eventual outcome of kind of sovereignty and blood quantum will be, but I think as long as a young person feels that they know who they are in their heart, nobody can take that away from them. Not a single person. Even if our children decide to be enrolled in Standing Rock, they're not going to take away being Oglala from me, and they're not going to take it away from them, and vice versa. So my encouragement to anybody who has felt this way about their own identity and about who you fall in love with, love is the greatest thing. It's the most powerful thing on the planet. And I was lucky that the person that I fell in love with was somebody who identifies and understands a piece of who I am. But there are also a lot of things that are complex within that, right, within colonial structures. So I think it's entirely about encouraging the generations to come about knowing who they are and keeping our culture strong. That's what matters. It doesn't matter how much blood is inside of you. It's about knowing who you are.
Thank you.
Well, thanks.
Hello, I'm Emma. I'm a sophomore here. I'm also a Native Hawaiian, and I was wondering, I think my biggest struggle of being so far away from home is kind of finding that balance between knowing your culture and being rooted in it, while also pursuing a higher education in a land that's not necessarily native to you at all. So how would you recommend Native students kind of find that balance between staying rooted in their culture, but also learning into this new community?
Absolutely. And one thing, Mahalo, thank you for coming up and speaking on your experiences. I think that it's one of those things where, and this is something that I want to say to the educators in the room as well, just because a student is a Native student, it doesn't mean that they understand all Native experiences. And that was really at the heart of my talk today, is saying to you that I only understand what it's like to be Lakota. A Native Hawaiian person has a very different experience than an Alaskan Native person, and across the tribes in the mainland, we all have deeply different experiences. I was sharing with Eric's class this morning that the common narrative in American society is the headdress, tribal headdress. That's Plains community, and there are only about 5 communities that actually identify with the headdress. Our communities are rich, they're complex, our religious bases are entirely different, our languages are entirely different. So I first want to say that it's really important not to make Native students feel like they're supposed to be the expert on all things Indigenous, because it's like asking somebody from another country about another country's perspectives on something. And it's really offensive to Native students to do that as well. So I want to preface that before I answer your question. I think that it's about understanding whose traditional homelands you're on, and you understand that being a Native student, is that especially in Hawaii, if you guys have not looked at Indigenous resilience in Hawaii and the complex relationships that the islands have had with the United States government, they are incredible. The Indigenous people in Hawaii are incredible. They have done so much resisting back against the colonizers' force. Now there's the huge fight that's going to go on with Mauna Kea and the telescope that has been revived, which is unbelievable to me. If you don't know about these issues, these are as deeply American issues as any of the other stuff that you pay attention to in your news feed. I think it's really important as Native people to acknowledge whose land you're on, and to also try to bring community into the spaces that you're in. So when we were at Penn, a lot of times we would try to reach out to the local Lenape community and say, we're having a dinner, is there an elder who can come and do a prayer for us? Or we're having an event at Powwow, we'd really love to invite your community to come. And I think if you're in a space where there isn't a recognizable Native community in the area, just being able to understand whose land you're on and acknowledging that as much as it can possible. But I'm also calling on all of everybody in this room to not assume that all Native people understand each other's identities and that we're very respectful of each other's cultures. So thank you for asking that. I appreciate it.
All right, so we'll welcome questions from anyone in the audience now.
I'm really nice in person, I promise. I just have very strong opinions about things.
Hi, I'm Ryan Trainer. I'm a professor in the physics department. I'm also an astronomer who uses telescopes on Mauna Kea. So as part of my work, I think it's, I try to work really hard to educate my students on, some of the history there, as well as some of the, complicated elements of, using telescopes and thinking about these things. We have discussions about Mauna Kea and in class, and so I really appreciate your bringing that up. I don't want to ask you to comment more on that necessarily because, again, that's not, focusing on your identity. But as a Native person in academia, obviously Mauna Kea astronomy, that is not the only way in which kind of science has had these very colonial elements. And one of the things when there were a lot of protests going on at UC Berkeley, my former institution, about Mauna Kea and TMT, there were a lot of these kind of other things that I learned a lot about the history of kind of science and Native American studies. And so I'm curious, in your experience in academia, I guess what have you seen that's been, have you seen elements of healing? Have you seen what has been examples of perhaps scientists, be they Native American scientists, white scientists, working to bridge that gap and to, kind of atone or correct, some of the painful things that are part of our history and part of our present?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I think, Native people, and this is not unique to our communities, but it seems to sort of be a foundation of research around Indigenous communities, is that unfortunately a lot of the research has been very extractive. It's been come into a community, don't develop relationship with the community, and then take. A lot of it has been around, obviously, natural resources and also looking at land. And, I think one of the things that I'm really inspired by, so I chose the University of Minnesota because there's a very large Native presence there. I'm in classrooms full of Native people. There are 198 Native graduate students on campus, which is incredibly inspiring, coming from an institution where I was one of 5 of 20,000. And so it's really inspiring and amazing to see people who are starting to do the work from an Indigenous perspective. So for example, I'm in a course with a young woman who's in a master's program focused in forestry, and we were reading a book in our Native Studies class, and they were talking a lot about logging, and she launched into this monologue yesterday in class about invasive species and the science research that's being done and the autonomy in her community. She's Menominee, the autonomy in her community and the power that is being given back to the Indigenous people. And my friend and I are just sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is so deeply inspiring to see. And that's just one very small example. I know she's going to go out into the field and conduct research in an ethical, community-focused way. And so I'm finally in a setting where I feel like that's a reality. And I've seen it, obviously. My mom's dissertation was focused on language, so not exactly like science focused, but just to see and understand that there are experts that are coming up out of Indigenous perspectives. And also I think that, and this was something that we were talking about in class this morning, I'm deeply disturbed. There was a student who shared that they haven't taken very many environmental studies that mentioned Indigenous people. What? I could not even believe that was something that they were being faced with, is that they're taking environmental studies focused classes that are not mentioning Indigenous rights or Indigenous access to land or Indigenous perspectives. So I can't pull up like specific examples, especially not being in the sciences. But I think I'm really empowered by and hopeful, seeing that there are now scholars that are coming forward and saying, you know what, this is actually about this is our community's right to have access to this information, and I'm really, really excited to see where that goes. this young woman yesterday talking about tree fungi that I don't even think about. I don't even think about that. And she had such a beautiful and rich perspective on how it impacted her community's sovereignty. And I was so inspired by that. So I'm sorry it's not specific to science, but.
I'm Stephanie Villar, a retiree from the college.
Okay.
I was hoping you could comment on Canada's truth and reconciliation process that they have been going through for quite a while with the First Nations.
Yes. Canada. No offense if anyone's from Canada. Or the US, either. Any. Canada is a very complex colonial structure. A lot of times, unfortunately, and this is something that I'm taking a Native Studies course this year, that my professor has really drilled into our minds, is that a lot of times we say that Canada and United States colonial structures are synonymous with each other, but they're not. They're deeply different, and the ways that they've impacted Indigenous people. Obviously, a lot of our issues, the issues within our communities are very similar, but they're not the same. And I think that that's a narrative that very often is sort of brought forward, is that we have similar trials and tribulations as Indigenous people. I think that truth and reconciliation, and again, I don't feel fully comfortable commenting on it not being a person from those communities. I have relatives that are up, again, across the border. My friend, I was sharing this with this class this morning, my friend says, we didn't cross the border crossed us, especially for Indigenous communities. There's a border that just shot straight through our nations. But I think that it's, an attempt to try to feel or fuel some sort of guilt by the Canadian government that they feel. And I'm appreciative that the government acknowledges the wrongdoings against Indigenous people. But I think a lot of Indigenous people in Canada continue to feel like the truth isn't being told, and they're not feeling like they've been reconciled either. And again, I can't speak to it not having had the experience up there, but from my friends who are Indigenous and citizens of Canada, they share that they are very, very skeptical of that administration, and that not enough of the opportunities are being given to Indigenous people to redefine what truth and reconciliation means. It's another colonial way to say this is how we feel that truth and reconciliation should be enacted for Indigenous people, instead of actually letting Indigenous people tell the government what would be effective. So I hope that's helpful.
In your talk, you mentioned a little bit about your experience and your struggle while you were at Penn. Yeah. And I'm wondering, because you're studying higher education and your master's is in higher education, yeah, and your focus is dismantling colonial education. So how do you combat at least the relics, even though people are trying the relics of colonial education at these prestigious institutions, while trying to focus, how do you combat that, and how do you stay focused and fight against the relics of colonial education?
That's a great question. Thank you for answering it. I will have a different answer in 6 years when my dissertation is put together. But for right now, what has kept me kind of going and moving forward, some of the frustrations that I have in higher education. So currently in the country, there are only 2 professors who identify as Native. One is tenured and the other one is tenure track. So for those of you guys that are in the academy, think about the number of people that you feel like represent you in the academy, and then boil that down to only 2 other people who are doing entirely different work on entirely different communities, and nobody's Lakota and doesn't understand those individualized experiences. So sometimes that can feel very daunting, right? I'm embarking in this space where there actually is no literature that's written by a Lakota person. And I'm sure that there are people in this room who've had that experience in their disciplines. But I think what keeps me going is the idea that there are young people behind me that are coming up and going to be in these structures.
To head over to bond check. Thanks very much.